Okay, so in the podcast today, I want to talk about something that is potentially a little contentious. I want to talk about the third-party data ecosystem and more specifically how that is represented in our industry and in the trade press, because I think that the arguments around the third-party data ecosystem are often imbalanced, and I think that they lack a key component, which is personal responsibility. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. Whenever I read an article in the trade press around third-party data, I always come across the same themes: opaqueness, inaccuracy, low veracity, and a myriad of challenges that face the third-party data ecosystem with respect to quality control. Now, I think all of those points are valid, and I would love to debate any one of them. But what is always lacking, or what is often lacking in any of those articles, is an attempt to balance that argument with a sense of personal responsibility on behalf of the buyer, who has a role in maintaining quality control on behalf of their clients. And it really surprises me because, at least in the agency environment, quality control has been part and parcel of our role and our responsibility for many, many years in inventory. I mean, it's absolutely core to the agency model that we establish quality of inventory across a number of different parameters, whether that's brand safety, whether it's viewability, whether it's fraud, whether it's the overall context. We have to maintain quality control within inventory acquisition in order to ensure that we're working effectively on behalf of the advertiser and making sure that the advertisement is placed in the correct environment. And none of those things seemingly translate into the data ecosystem. And there just is a lack of personal responsibility when it comes to selection and deployment of third-party data assets, or so it seems. And that just, really confuses me, because I think that if we don't effectively translate those same measures and quality control instruments and mechanisms from inventory into data, then we really have to question what exactly our role is in data-driven advertising, and how we're providing incremental value to our clients when we're selecting data partners to work with. So that's the premise of the podcast. It's essentially that there is a imbalance in the argument around third-party data that's often represented as simply being a low-quality asset through which you can decision media and target particular audiences. And I think that there is oftentimes a key factor in the debate that is overlooked, which is personal responsibility on behalf of the buyers to ensure that quality is maintained. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. Now, when we're building out partnerships with our third-party data suppliers, we're very specific and we're quite prescriptive around the measures that they have to put in place to ensure data quality. And we have a 5-point principle to ensure that data quality is high. And those 5 points are source, segmentation, scale, specification, and standards. I'm going to talk about each of those in turn, just to give you a better sense of what it is I'm talking about, and to help you to evaluate your potential partners. So source, first and foremost, where is the data coming from? Is it digital data collected from a publisher network? Is it offline data collected through panels, collected through surveys? Is it onboarded? What is the source of the data, and how is it onboarded to the point at which it can be activated and executed against? That's obviously incredibly important in establishing the first level of quality control. What is the origin of the data asset itself? Segmentation, what are the attributes and what are the characteristics that are being captured by a particular data partner? Do they focus on a specific area? Is it business to business? Is it socio-demographics? Is it location? Is it interest? Is it in-market propensity? There are some data providers that provide a full spectrum of assets, but for the most part, when we're looking at our partnerships, we're looking for strategic value, we're looking for incrementality, and we're trying to identify specialist resource and specialist data sets in order to meet specific campaign requirements. So that's incredibly important to us. Not just the source of the data, but the attributes and the characteristics that go into segmentation. And where there is specialism in segmentation. The other aspect of segmentation is how the segments are actually built. So how is the data provider taking event level data that it's tracking across its ecosystem and translating that into audience segmentation? So is it using Boolean logic? Is it using recency and frequency? Is it using modeling techniques? If so, what are those modeling techniques? How far are they extrapolating from a seed set out into a global population? All of these different parameters and variables come into question when we're looking at the veracity of a potential data partner. The third pillar is scale. So obviously, we operate in an ecosystem that is fundamentally built on scalability and the requirement to be able to effectively scale campaigns, not just across one device, but across many, not just within one market, but within many. So if you're running a multi-market global campaign that is omni-channel and requires activation across multiple different devices, then you need segmentation that can scale effectively within all of those different environments. And although there is a case to be made for micro segmentation and small segments that involve audience memberships of hundreds or single digit thousands, I think that most planners and buyers simply don't have the time, don't have the resource to commit to a strategy like that. And, for the most part, scalability is something that needs to be taken into consideration. The fourth pillar is specification, which really speaks to the full spectrum of access points. So all of the different ways in which we can access a particular data set and the granularity at which we can access that data set. So we're all aware that, we have standard off-the-shelf audience segmentation that is made available by data providers in activation endpoints, like in demand-side platforms, for instance. But for the most part, that is just a fraction of the capability of a given data provider. They have to think strategically about what segments they make available within the demand-side platforms because they're limited oftentimes to a threshold of audience segments that they're able to push within those platforms. And they focus on those segments that are going to be high revenue generators. So they focus on socioeconomic and demographic segmentation because it's still commonplace for planners and buyers to trade in age and gender and socioeconomic status. So it's still very common, as an example, for traders to buy 18 to 34-year-old females who have a high income. So standard socio-demographic and economic segmentation is commonplace within demand-side platforms, but as a rough estimate, you're probably looking at somewhere between 10 and 20% of what a data provider has available to it in terms of its raw data assets that is then made available within an activation point, a demand-side platform. So there's a huge amount of value, there's a huge amount of data that is available to the provider, but not to the buyer if you're only accessing through the activation endpoint. And you can look at the full spectrum of access points, and you can look at ways in which you can build more custom relationships, more bespoke relationships with the data providers in order to ensure that you are generating the maximum value from that partnership. So, whether or not that's accessing custom segmentation that is bespoke to you and bespoke to the campaign that you're activating, whether or not it is licensing a raw data stream of event level, timestamp level data and curating a lot of the segmentation within your own environment. There are multiple access points, and, across the spectrum, there are multiple commercial models, operating models, and contractual models to support and to facilitate those different access points. So specification is very important because it gets to the heart of customization. The final piece is the standards that the data provider is putting around the quality of its own assets. So how is the data provider maintaining the source of its data? How is the data provider refreshing data collection? How is it ensuring that segmentation is accurate, so that if we place an individual within the sports enthusiast audience, we actually know that that individual is a sports enthusiast, and we can continue to refresh and reference that characteristic or that attribute against the individual. So there are a number of different tools and techniques and instruments that data providers put in place to manage and maintain quality. So, for instance, oftentimes data providers maintain a panel of declared and claimed behaviors and demographic information in order to maintain accuracy against predicted variables or modeled variables. Oftentimes they work with independent auditors like Nielsen or Comscore to evaluate their accuracy against standard demographic segmentation. Some vendors put in place anti-fraud and bot detection technology in order to ensure that the traffic that they're working with and the data sets that they're collecting are human verified. So there are a number of different ways in which data providers can put quality control checks in place to maintain the quality of the assets that they're bringing to market. But that's really just one step. And if you're building out a data partnership network, you need to maintain quality control from your own perspective. So it's always recommended that you put in place your own checks and balances to ensure that the assets that are being deployed are as accurate as they possibly can be. And that's really, I think, the main point that I wanted to make in this podcast is that there is a lot of responsibility on the buyer. There is a lot of responsibility on the entity that is reviewing, that is contracting, and that is executing on these data sets to ensure their quality. And if you want to be successful in building out a data partnership network, then you need to invest heavily in the relationships that you're building. And if you do that, you'll end up reducing and mitigating against a lot of the different downsides or challenges that are often levied against the third-party data ecosystem. So, opaqueness being, I think, one of the major criticisms that is levied against the third-party data ecosystem. Well, opaqueness is a reality of poor relationships. And if you build relationships with your partners and if you invest in those relationships, then you will build a certain level of transparency into the way in which your partners operate, into the way in which they build their segmentation, into what drives their business. And I think that to some extent that art seems to have been lost within the data ecosystem. I mean, it's certainly still part and parcel of inventory analysis. And, I hope that, using the 5S methodology, source, segmentation, scale, specification, and standards, you get a little closer to, building out better partnerships with your potential third-party data providers. Thank you.